Good Tuesday evening to you. It is June 22nd, potentially the longest day of the year. I'm Jamie Beckett, AOPA Foundation's ambassador in Florida. Joining me tonight, as always, is the spectacular Pat Brown, all the way from Texas, and way over there in California, Kay Sunrum, the smart one among us. Tonight we're going to be talking about the big three: fuel starvation, controlled flight into terrain, and VFR into IMC, or visual flight into instant meteorological conditions. Of course, as always, you can write in on any topic you want, and we will entertain that question because we are that classy. Now, tonight, behind the board, we do not have the normal Kevin and Philip. They're on special assignment and something I'm not allowed to talk about. But we do have Eric Webb. By the way, Eric Webb is with a C and a K. He's the special kind of Eric. He is in the North Woods of Upper Michigan, as you recall from last time. And I don't know how the guy does it, but he cobbles this together with 2 large coffee cans, a line of a roll of fishing line, and an entire pickup truck full of AA batteries. Hey, however it works, it works. Guys, nice to see you here. How you doing, Pat?
We are hanging in there. I'm coming to you live and direct from West Houston Airport, and I'm going to have to bug off of here at about 3 or 4 minutes before the end of the show, so I can go and talk to a bunch of fast team people just down the hall.
See, people say, what is it that ambassadors do? We do whatever has to be done. Pat, you're doing a great job, and I'm proud of you. Kay, what are you up to? I understand it's only 4 o'clock there, and I'm missing dinner. How are you Californian people doing tonight?
We're doing good. You know, we have the May gray June gloom, which sometimes starts in April and goes through July, but I can't complain because I get to fly. Any day I get to fly is a good day, right?
I like it. And Sal, tag me. Go ahead, Pat.
You also got happy hour.
It's coming up. Yes.
Well, we've got a comment from Sal, and Sal, I apologize. I'm going to butcher this. Taglarino, who says, I win, I'm farther away, which compels me to ask, where are you, Sal? By the way, we've got a special AirVenture episode coming up of Ask an Ambassador in late July. So any questions you have, please send them to ambassadors@aopa.org. And I'm talking any aeronautical question on any topic: buying an airplane, starting a club, working with a flight school, taking a check ride, whatever, which headsets do we like best? Whatever interests you, go ahead and write to us. I promise you, we'll get to your question. And with that, let's talk about this fuel starvation thing. I actually went and looked a little bit, and I picked up 4 fuel starvation accidents. They're not always pilot error, but they often are preventable, aren't they, Kay?
Absolutely. Yeah, some good planning goes a long way, and sometimes we're used to doing things a certain way, and we think, all right, well, I got enough fuel. I've done this flight several times, and you don't take into account the weather, the headwinds, or that you're on an instrument flight this time, and it's really about the planning. That's a big component of it.
Yeah, I was just talking to Eric about that before. I've done a couple long trips in the 152 over the last several years, and I've had ground speeds as high as 124 knots and as low as in the low 50s, but the same amount of fuel. So the distance isn't going to work out. So it really is one of those things you have to think about. You can't just say, oh, I've got 200, 400, 500 miles endurance. You have an endurance that's measured in time. And Pat, I don't know about you, but I really don't like getting near the limit of that time. If I've got 4 hours worth in the tanks, I'm not flying more than 3.
No, that's true. And it's not just that, but, there is a physical endurance portion to that as well. So oftentimes, that's going to dictate when I land as much as the fuel will.
And, that's not just the biological needs people are thinking of. Just being fatigued is a real thing, and that can push us to make improper decisions. Like, if I don't stop here for fuel, I could save 40 minutes and I'll get home sooner. Well, will you really get home? Let's take a look at a couple examples. Just since I pulled these up, I went to extensive effort, used Google all by myself without a net. Just last year, September 9th in Knoxville, Tennessee, a Cessna landed on Interstate 640 refueled on the road, and took off again. Now, there's no injuries and no damage. But Kay, I'm going to imagine the embarrassment level on that pretty high. When you get back to the FBO, someone's going to notice that you were on the news.
Absolutely. There's a lot of good reasons to be on the news, but as a pilot, landing on a freeway or somebody's yard is not a good reason, and it would be really, really embarrassing. So plan ahead of time and take into account all those other factors, and keep in mind that your destination sometimes changes, and you might have a reason to go to one airport, but you should always have an alternate, and you should plan for the fuel for that alternate also, and to take into account the winds at that time, not when you're departing.
Absolutely. By the way, Sal has popped in. He lives in Florida. See, he's a smart man. Florida is the place to live. But for reasons that defy logic, he's in Shanghai at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he's with us. Sal, thank you. And we got our old buddy Nils Hansen back. Good evening to you too, Nils. This fuel starvation thing, though, it's not just a newbie thing. It's not just something that happens to low-time people. And Pat, I know we've talked about this a number of times offline. There was one from 2018, Hiram, Utah, an ATP who was relocating a Cub Crafters aircraft. He's ferrying the airplane. He ran out of fuel 45 minutes into the flight, which is really, that's not good. He had not refueled the aircraft prior to departure because he looked at the sight gauges and thought they looked full. Unfortunately, the aircraft was damaged. The pilot was injured, because there are places, let's face it, in Utah, you're not necessarily over a football field all the time where you can put the thing. Pat, that's kind of the pucker factor, isn't it? When that engine goes out because you skipped checking the fuel and saved yourself that 3 minutes, that's a really unpleasant moment, isn't it?
It will get your attention. As one who has had a situation several years ago with fuel starvation, not exhaustion, two big different things. Yep. When that mill stops turning, it will get your attention in a heartbeat. And fortunately, we were able to land and fix the issue and take right back off again. And thank goodness for big Tundra tires on a tailwheel airplane. But it turned out to be a non-event. But at the same time, I can tell you personal experience, it'll get your attention.
Yeah, I've had the same experience, unfortunately, in a Super Cub. And fortunately, I was able to switch tanks. I was only at 1,000 feet when the engine, and it's not instantaneous. It kind of surges a little bit, and you get power, then you lose power, and you have that mental thing, and you're like, what's going on here? Why is it doing that? And then all of a sudden it just dies off. And you have a very limited amount of time to figure out things to do. I'll tell you, Kay, this is just a decision-making thing. This is a judgment one, and the classic, where I was an instructor in Connecticut many years ago, 30 years ago or so, and I had a best flight student I ever had, this woman named Marcy, who was just fantastic. She's going out on her private check ride. She's at the hold short line with the DPE when an airplane comes in on final dead stead, prop stopped, landing in 172. And the guy said on the radio he wanted to know how much fuel his airplane held, so he ran it out at altitude. You can't get much dumber than that. Don't you think, Kay, that sometimes, and as Pat points out, fuel starvation is different than fuel exhaustion. We can certainly touch on that. But the preponderance of these is actually a decision-making issue, isn't it?
It is. And statistics show that most of these incidences happen very close to the airport. So it's not that the pilot is trying to get to an airport that's 100 miles away and they were so off on the numbers. No, so a lot of times it's within like 2 or 3 miles of the airport. And that's where that get there right is like, oh, I know I can get there. I don't need to stop. What an inconvenience it would be for me to stop. Now it's going to add another half hour or an hour, or where I'm going to stop. The choices are, the fuel prices are really expensive and I don't want to stop there. That comes into play, but just imagine how expensive it will be if you land short of the airport. And that's what happens most of the time. You're very close to the airport.
You're darn right. I mean, being a half mile short is the same as being 100 miles short. You're not on the pavement. You're not on the runway. And beyond the damage you can do to the aircraft, the injuries you have yourself. By the way, I have to do a little segue. Thomas Eaton says, what a great group of ambassadors. Clearly, he's talking about you two. But thank you, Thomas. We appreciate that. And Jay Smith makes a great point. So many airports available to land. Why not stop for fuel? Trying to stretch it and get that last little bit out, that's not good if you don't make it. And it's entirely possible you won't make it. There are things beyond your control at the airport where somebody's stopped on the runway or something's happened. And Pat, this is directly connected to our insurance rates. The more accidents there are in GA, the more coverage has to be dealt with, and the higher our insurance rates go. And as aircraft owners, that kind of affects us, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean that's a whole other can of worms to open. We were laughing a few minutes ago about the guy that landed on the highway and the embarrassment factor and the poor planning, and that it just kind of reminded me of the video that the ASI released about 3 weeks ago on that Baron
here
in Texas that went down, and 6 people were killed, and unfortunately the pilot was a good friend of mine, and it was just a chain of events. One miscalculation on his fuel early on, and that he didn't catch, and as he continued to fly multiple flights after that initial mistake, essentially when he took off on that last flight, he probably thought he had enough, and he crashed. I think it was something like 14 miles from the airport. After
he was only short by 4 gallons. He would have made it.
Yeah,
but you're right. A calculation error is a big issue.
And then you have almost. I suspect it's probably avoidable, but then you have kind of the last minute thing. I have some friends that were coming back from West Texas a few weeks ago, and there was some challenging weather that caused them to divert when they really hadn't planned on it. The closest airport was close enough that was the airport they decided to go to, because they were getting to the point where they couldn't maintain legal fuel reserves, and they landed, and then they found out after they landed the airport had been notamed no fuel for the last couple of weeks. So they had to wait until the weather cleared so that they could have enough VFR fuel reserves to get gas at another airport.
Yeah, sometimes it's worth calling ahead. Hey, Richard Elliott Ortiz writes in, new private pilot. Congratulations, Richard. We're very pleased for that. He says, during run-up, he doesn't do an idle check. And Kay, do you do this when you're flying the carbureted Cessnas and Pipers? And I always do. I do the run-up, and I pull on the carb heat and make sure there's a drop. But then I retard the throttle all the way back to idle to see if it continues running, because sometimes it doesn't. It looks like it happened to Richard, where he's in the pattern, he pulls the carb heat on. When he retards the throttle, the engine dies. That's a little more exciting than it needs to be, and that's fuel starvation, not exhaustion. You can fix that pretty quickly, but that's a heart-stopping moment when you're low on final, isn't it, Kay?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
man, that stuff. I was flying with Ben from General Aviation News, Ben Sclair, my publisher there, and I was doing the run up and did that, pulled the carb heat out and pulled the throttle back, and I talked my way through it. And I said, let's just make sure this keeps running. And he goes, oh, that's why people do that. It's all those little things you learn from flying with different people, but it happened to Richard, and that's one of those things you don't need. Now I'll make a point. Go ahead, Pat.
Oddly enough, and I've been flying, since Noah's Ark. I actually wasn't taught to do that. And of course, I mean, back when I was flying, there early on, there weren't too many fuel injected engines out there, but I wasn't taught to do that. So that's something that I've actually come to fairly late, and I do think it's a good idea. I've never had an engine quit on short final. I have had one quit rolling out, and which makes me wonder what would have happened if I'd had to add some throttle to it at some point down the road. But it'll get your attention.
Yeah, my first ever engine failure was that. It was in a 182, and I was in the flare over the runway when the engine quit. So it's the best place you can lose one, but these things happen. By the way, last point on. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kay.
We were talking about procedures and things like that, and I want to make sure that the audience is also aware that sometimes it's the extra information that we have in our airplanes, the TAA, the technically advanced aircraft, that have the fuel ring. But that data is only as good as the data that you put into it. And so when you're entering that number in the fuel totalizer, how much you added or how much fuel there is, you got to be accurate on that. And if you're sharing an airplane with somebody else, don't assume that the number that's in there is indeed accurate, because they might have added fuel that you didn't know about. So you got to go out and measure it, and don't eyeball it. Use a fuel stick, or if there isn't one for the make and model that you use, there are some generic ones that you can calibrate when you know exactly how much fuel is. So carry one of those universal sticks. They're like $10, $12. It's really, really cheap. Always keep one in your flight bag, and make sure that you know unequivocally how much fuel is in there before you enter that data into the computer, because otherwise that fuel ring is very, very misleading. It's not measuring the actual fuel in your tanks. It's measuring based off of what you entered.
Yeah, and you have to be careful of those assumptions. Even for the older analog planes, much like during Noah's Ark days, Pat, where we would just assume, well, my plane burns 6 gallons an hour, my plane burns 9 gallons an hour, my plane burns 14 gallons an hour. When you jump into another airplane of that type, you can't assume it's the same fuel burn. It's probably close, but you don't know what work's been done to that engine. You don't know if it's got an issue. And if you just assume you've got X amount of fuel and you're burning so much per hour, so I've got 4 hours worth of duration, maybe you do, maybe you don't. And if you're planning for that full duration, you might get a big surprise.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll throw one other thing in on the starvation thing. There are times when you did the right thing. You put the right amount of fuel in. You were very careful and fastidious about physically checking the fuel, sticking it, sumping it. You did everything right, and you still run out of fuel in the air. That can be because the vent is clogged on the cap, or the vent from the tank itself. Maybe down south here we get mud daubers who build nests in there, but if that gets clogged, you don't have good flow through the tank. It's kind of like a soda bottle. When you turn it upside down, it's going glug, glug, glug. You can actually crush that tank down in size, so years later you don't have the capacity you thought you had, and you can run out. Pat, were you going to make a comment along those lines? I had a sense you were thinking actively.
Well, in my case, the fuel starvation issue had to do with an obstruction of the fuel line. And we were able to, again, diagnose what that problem was and address it, and then just take off out of the field that we landed in. But in this particular case, yeah, it wasn't a vent issue. It certainly could have been, but it turned out to be a mud dauber, to be quite honest with you.
Now, do you play that game with yourself as you fly, Pat, especially over unfamiliar territory? Because I know I check the fuel, I know I'm good, but I don't know there's not an obstruction someplace. And I don't know a seal's not going to fail or something. So do you play that little mental game where if I lost the engine now, I could go there, or I'm going to change my route a little bit because there's more fields over here than over here?
All the time.
Oh, good. I'm not alone.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Kay, let's segue into the next part of our big three, CFIT, controlled flight into terrain. Amazingly enough, this does happen, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, to some extent, I think autopilots being as affordable and readily available as they are is part of the problem for those. There have been accidents where people have set their autopilot, and they don't take into account that big number on the quadrant with the highest obstacle, and their plane flies just beautifully until it hits an obstacle. What's your thought on controlled flight into terrain?
That's one of those topics where it blows my mind that there's so many people who fly perfectly good airplanes right into the dirt, right into the mountain. And as far as the autopilot, regardless of what system you're using, you always need to know every single moment what your position is and how high you are above the surface directly below you and ahead of you. And you got to be cautious of following that pink line. Mm-hmm. We love that pink line, but that pink line is not going to help you avoid terrain. And so the danger of just following that pink line blindly is when you go, maybe you sat at home and you planned everything out, and that's great, but very rarely does our actual flight equal exactly what we planned, right? For many different variables, whether it's weather or traffic, regardless, you're not going to necessarily fly what you planned. And the danger is when you go off that line and then you hit that direct enter, that pink line is going to still take you to that destination. And if you just go off and follow that, it might take you right into a mountain. And it has happened before. It has happened with experienced professionals on commercial flights. Yep. There's some videos on ASI about that. And take a look at that and be really careful that you know exactly where you are. I think one of the biggest causes of CFIT is the loss of situational awareness. And as we get into more advanced aircraft or even basic aircraft with the autopilot, like you mentioned, Jamie, we get dependent on that, and we just think, all right, I'm just going to follow the pink line. And
yeah, you mentioned ASI, and we're an acronym-rich environment here, but that's Aviation Safety Institute. And for those of you watching, if you just go to AOPA ASI in Google, or just put ASI, and you'll find it. There's tremendous content there, great educational content. And yeah, Pat, Kay's not wrong. We kind of talk about this as loss of situational awareness, where we get a little lazy, maybe is a reasonable term. We're following the magenta line. I'm where I'm supposed to be. I'm on my altitude. Well, is your altitude really appropriate? Because there can be optical illusions. It's not just mountains. There can be optical illusions and meteorological things that get people kind of off their game. And as Kay says, people have flown the airplane right into the dirt, not realizing they were on a downward trajectory, not holding altitude.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that kind of stuff is going to happen at night. We have a very simple solution. If you have a chart in front of you, a IFR or VFR chart, and those numbers there, those little quadrants, those are maximum elevation figure numbers or obstacle clearance numbers, depending on which chart you're looking at. And if you stay above those numbers, whatever those numbers might be, you won't hit whatever is in that quadrant. So there is a defense mechanism right there if we just take advantage of it. That is for sure.
And yeah, Pat, to add to that, even if you're not an instrument pilot or an instrument flight plan, take a look at what the instrument charts show. Because if you're flying and you know what the MEA is, minimum en route altitude, then that's a good thing. And you can use all of those tools even on a VFR flight plan. So,
yeah, we've got Mr. Smith is back saying he's a Florida Flatlander wimp right here. I'm one of those. And he always flies IFR on Victor Airways in the mountains. And I'll tell you, when I started instrument flying, the MEA, the minimum en route altitude, was a good one, but I always wanted to know the MOCA, the minimum obstacle clearance altitude. I don't want to hit anything. If I lose radio communications, I don't love it, but I just don't want to hit anything. And Pat, as you say, that can happen at night. One of the things we tend to gloss over on NOTAMs is tower lights that are out. And towers are tough to see even with the lights. But we've had that happen down here. People start thinking, well, Florida's flat as a pancake. I can cruise around at 1,000 feet. No, you actually can't. There are many places where towers go up to 1,200, 1,500, 2,000 feet, even in a place that you think is fairly flat. And Pat, flying out of your area, you got downtown Houston just off to the east there. So, I mean, there's stuff to hit if you're going to scud run around.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. In the southern part of the city, there are 5 or 6 towers. A couple of them are over 2,000 feet AGL. If you're going down to Galveston to enjoy a $100 hamburger and you're coming from where I live and where I base out of, there are two towers right next to each other, each of which are about 2,000 feet tall, and another one that's about 1,900 feet tall. And if you go north out of here, there's another tower on a straight line to a really good restaurant that, again, is about 2,000 feet tall. And if you're just going out there kind of fat, dumb, and happy and scud running, or even just deciding you're going to fly low and slow because, hey, it's a lot more fun to look at what's down below when you're close to it, you could end up with a really, really bad day. Here, we're about 100 feet above sea level. Down there where you are, you're right pretty much at sea level. So I pay a lot of attention to those quadrants that I talked about, particularly on the VFR charts, to see where the highest obstacle is. Because I guarantee if you're flying along the peninsula of Florida and you see a 1.9 or something like that in one of those sectors, you can be darn sure that it's not a mountain. It's going to be an intense sort.
It's going to be tough to spot.
Yeah, and the same thing here. You see those kind of numbers, and it's darn well not going to be a building. More than likely, it's going to be an antenna.
Out here, that would be a hill.
Yeah, you brought up situational awareness before, and it's a great point because you're in California, really one of the most beautiful places on the planet. Just fantastic weather, beautiful scenery. It's just terrific. But if you were to take off and turn north, to your left, off to the west, is just water. And hey, we can go do whatever we want. But to your right, to the east, there's a whole series of mountains, all different mountains, different heights. Getting just a little bit off from where you think you are in challenging conditions can be literally a life or death thing, and not to be dark, but that's the Kobe Bryant crash. They weren't where they thought they were. And how do you deal with that, Kay, in an area where the terrain, it's not that you've lost altitude, it's that the terrain rises up to meet the aircraft?
Correct. So this area is, it's a beautiful place to fly. And if you haven't been out here in Southern California, come on down, send me a note. It is a wonderful GA location. I want to say that first. However, we have lots of different terrains. And like you said, the ocean on one side, we got lots of mountains and microclimates because, and the weather pattern is different within 5 miles. I'm talking 5 miles. I'm not exaggerating. You could be in VFR condition and then 5 miles closer towards the coast, it could be low IFR. And so you also have to watch out for that. And it is one of the busiest airspace in the world. And so if you're not comfortable with flying in this type of airspace, you got to fly with a CFI or another pilot who is familiar with this area. And to answer your question, Jamie, it comes with practice, and practice. And not just with the airspace and with the weather, but also just getting to know the area. And you got to review the charts, and situational awareness is a must, because it's not that you're going to get lost, it's that you can get in trouble because of the rising terrain, because of the microclimates, because of airspace that you don't want to be in. We also have a lot of SUA, special use airspace, a ton of military airspace around here. I'm not talking about just MOAs, military operation areas. I'm talking about restricted airspace where you should not go, or else you're going to get some, company on your wingtips. So you got to watch out for all of that. And it really just comes with due diligence on the ground in planning and knowing your charts and knowing the procedures at the different airports, and then, flying with a CFI until you get comfortable. And then you get to enjoy all the beauty out here.
Well, that's kind of the interesting thing. We do tend to fly a lot in our local area, especially GA pilots, but periodically we go off over the horizon and get into areas we're unfamiliar with. And I got to thank Mr. Papadopoulos. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your first name. I've tried. I'm just going to ruin it. But makes a good point. In Greece, it's very mountainous. You've got a lot of mountains out in California. It's really worth flying with somebody who has mountain flying experience, because, as a flatlander in Florida, where really the high point is 300 feet, we don't have elevation here. The air movements around mountains, what's going to happen on the leeward side, and I'm going to need some assistance on that. Somebody who can kind of guide me and show me what to look out for. Different types of cloud formations and things like that. And Kay, did you do any kind of special training when you were flying out in California? Because you started in the East, right?
I did. Yeah, I did all my primary training in Long Island.
So when you went, by the way, did you fly out of MacArthur?
I did. Yeah, Brookhaven and MacArthur.
The company car I've had for the last few years, 106 Uniform Charlie, it's down here. I did my first flight training at MacArthur in Long Island, and somebody sent me pictures late last night that they found 106 Uniform Charlie on the ramp at MacArthur. So, see, there's a full connection here. We just got every corner of the United States plugged in. But when you got out west, did you go fly with a CFI and do some mountain training? Because you have flown through the passes and things, and I know there have been times where you didn't fly through the pass because the conditions weren't right.
That's right. And so there's 2 periods of time in my flying career. One was in Northern California. So I was a commercial pilot then, wasn't a CFI at that time. And I needed to get a mountain checkout, and I wanted to go to Lake Tahoe. And so I flew with the CFI, had a checkout, and that was the first time I was really flying around the mountains because, it was, the hills is what we call some of the other mountains in other parts of the country, but it was new to me. And so I needed to get some practice with that. And then I came down to Southern California about 10 years ago. And at that time I was a CFI, and here it's different. It's different from Northern California. And I had not really flown in this type of airspace, even though I'm very comfortable with Bravo, with the New York, at that time it was TCA when I was there in New York, but I was familiar with Bravo airspace. But coming down here to the Los Angeles area, I needed to really sit down and review the charts and then fly with the CFI a few times and get comfortable. Now it's like the back of my hand. I'm no problem, but it just took some practice. And again, I was a CFI, not a newbie, and you still have to do your due diligence and know the airspace.
And this is kind of how the fuel starvation or fuel exhaustion links together with the controlled flight into terrain. I've got a friend from high school who owns a ranch out in San Luis Obispo, and I was sitting up on a mountaintop with him one evening, and the sun sets, and it's not at all like Florida. It's beautiful, and so is Florida, but it's beautiful. And as the sun is setting, the fog starts rolling in like a river over the lower hills. Now, if I was flying in and had planned to land on a grass strip in one of those valleys, I got a problem because that's not going to be there. And even if I turn around, unless I'm going pretty quickly inland, I'm not going to have a place to go. So, Pat, sometimes these things fit together, and planning is a real factor, not just what's the situation right now, but what's going to be the situation an hour from now? What's my fuel situation? What's my ability to compensate for the weather or deal with it? And what options do I have if things don't work out?
Yeah, once the dominoes start to fall, sometimes it's hard to keep them all from going. And we all talk about the chain, that accident chain. If you break one link in the chain, the accident doesn't happen. And unfortunately, there are so many examples. If you look at the NTSB, I talk about this in Rusty Pilot all the time. If you look at NTSB accident reports, you're going to find that all of them, either have arrogance, ignorance, complacency, or distractions as one or more elements in the accident. Boy, you should be. I tell my students when I'm teaching, I tell my applicants when we're doing debriefs, I'll tell them, if when you really get comfortable, when you get a little bit better than maybe you are now, you're always thinking not just one step ahead of the airplane, but maybe 2 steps ahead of the airplane. And if you really get good at it, maybe even 3 steps ahead of the airplane. In other words, as far ahead as you can possibly think could happen. It's like a chess game. It's just like a chess game. So, one thing leads to another, and once those dominoes start, it's hard to stop them.
Well, and there's a certain arrogance or egotistical nature to being a human, to being a pilot. We believe we can handle things because we've handled things in the past. But the truth is, when the stress starts mounting up, your ability to make a rational decision drops pretty dramatically. And really, the best example I can think of is this ridiculous TV show my daughter watches. I don't know the name of it. I don't know the host's name. but he's on the street in New York City. He goes up and asks people questions. And he goes up to this woman and starts screaming in her face, name a woman to win the prize. And she can't do it because he keeps screaming, name a woman, name a woman. And all she's got to do is say her own name, and she wins. But because she's under stress, she can't do it. And we're not immune to that. The fact that you get under stress, all of a sudden the destination airport's not available, the weather's getting worse, the fuel is getting low, the sun is setting and is getting dark. All these things, like you say, Pat, these all ball up into being an untenable situation. And because that's all happening, your ability to make a decision, a good decision, starts to degrade pretty dramatically, which is why we call it an accident chain. Each one of those things got us into a position where it was harder and harder to get out of until there's just no way out of it.
Yeah,
And oftentimes, as the flight gets longer, the pilot gets tired. So you got to keep in mind the fatigue factor. That is real. That the I'm safe checklist. We don't want to gloss over that because those things really do play a factor. And the longer the flight is, and the closer you are towards the destination, and the more you keep pushing it, then you got to pay attention to your own body, and your fatigue will be another factor.
Yeah, it's only 20 more minutes. It's only 20 more minutes. So
yeah. Well, and we've all made some fairly long single engine flights this year, but a lot of people aren't aware of that. I just flew from here, Central Florida, to Spartanburg, South Carolina. That was my first hop going up to Maryland. But I had to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get things ready because they were closing the runway at my airport at 7. So I had to be off the ground as soon as sun comes up. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon by the time I get there. I've been awake since 4. It seems like, oh, it's early afternoon. I can keep going. You get pretty tired. And I don't know if you can tell, but I'm no longer in my 20s. So sometimes Daddy needs a nap. By the way, Pat, Kevin Cortez reaches out and says, has Pat ever flown a Comanche? He looks like a Comanche pilot. And we were just talking about Comanches yesterday. What the deal, buddy?
For those folks that are just joining us for the first time, this seems to be a running gag. I think early on a year ago when we first started doing these things, I mentioned I think that I have a Comanche. And all of a sudden, people started asking questions about that. And I think the topic all of a sudden turned from something serious to just something about Comanche flying. So, Kevin, thank you so much for that.
Well, if it makes you feel better, Steve Ells is a mechanic and pilot and writer out west. He owns a Comanche, and I know from Facebook he actually flew it today. So it's a perfectly valid question.
It's a great airplane. I have a 260C model and 1969 vintage. It's a great airplane. It's got curtains, for crying out loud. What's not to like about an airplane? It's got curtains. And
oh man,
flies like a dream. I love it. And what can I say?
Well, let's talk about something that I'm going to bet every one of us has faced at some point. VFR into IMC. It's a real risk for pilots flying under VFR, visual flight rules. Every once in a while something happens, and maybe even unexpectedly, and a pilot will get into IFR or IMC, instrument meteorological conditions. Basically, I can't see anymore. Can't see the ground. I can't see outside. And Kay, I'm going to come to you on this. You're a proficient CFI. You're an instrument pilot. A non-instrument pilot who ends up in IMC unexpectedly probably isn't going to stay right side up for very long, are they?
That's right. We're talking about seconds. So we're not talking about minutes, and ASI, Air Safety Institute, has one video specifically on that. It is a very popular one. It's one that I think every pilot should watch, whether you're instrument rated or not, because sometimes us instrument rated pilots, we want to fly VFR and we think, okay, well, I'm instrument rated, I can handle this, and that can cause problems too. But you really don't have that much time, and if that happens, you need to get some help. You shouldn't be timid. Ask ATC, declare an emergency. A lot of pilots, they don't declare an emergency, but that is, or it will become an emergency, and we're talking about less than a minute that you have. So
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Kay.
No, go ahead.
It's a number of years ago. It was December, and it was probably 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. My wife said to me, let's go fly to dinner somewhere. And I thought, she wants to fly to dinner. Maybe there is a Santa Claus. I mean, it was in December. But I said, well, yeah, where do you want to go? So she told me a little Mexican place not too far from her home airport, but it required us to fly about 10 miles south, hook around these big 2,000-foot towers that I was telling you about, and turn east and go to this little airport in Pearland. So I called. It was a gorgeous night. There was not a cloud in the sky. It was an absolutely spectacular night to go fly. Not very cold, cool, but not cold. And I called and got the weather forecast, and it was stellar. It was going to be a perfect evening. So we took off and we headed down south from our home airport over the Sugar Land Airport. Towers are over on my left-hand side. We go a little bit past them and make a left-hand turn. And as I'm flying along over towards the Pearland Airport at this point, I noticed the lights below me are twinkling, and suddenly I'm thinking it's a little early for Christmas lights, but it's really pretty. And then those lights just disappeared. And here we are, VFR into IMC, and I'm at about 1,800 feet. Those towers are 2,000 feet, a couple of miles off, but put yourself in that position. For that moment, the thought is, where are those towers and which way do I turn? It seemed like forever, but they're off to the left. So we made a right-hand turn. Of course, all my charts and plates and everything, where are they? In the baggage compartment. Yeah. It's a gorgeous night outside. And so we made a 180. And as I was flying past the Sugar Land Airport, I asked them if they had any reports of IMC in the area, and they said no. And I said, well, you do now. And so I told them where it was. It was just very localized, just tiny. Anyway, we went back to the airport, parked the airplane, and went to a Mexican restaurant 5 minutes from the house instead of the one. But that's the first and only time that I have had that kind of an experience, and it left a real impression. So,
yeah, that can get you. I mean, I just had that going around Charleston, North Carolina. There's a bunch of towers off to the west of the airport, and you're trying to stay out of the airspace. And where are those towers? And even though you've got an indication on your chart of where they are, you're like, are they east of the road or west of the road? Am I far enough away? And that's under reasonably good conditions. Yeah. Kay, let me ask you a question that's a judgment question. I've had flights where I've canceled a VFR flight because it was VFR at my departure point and it was VFR at my destination, but in between was 400 overcast. And I would cancel because while I can legally fly over that and be VFR over the top, if I should lose my engine, I have no options. I'm going to break out at or below 400, and there's no time to make a decision then, so I don't go. Conversely, I've had a similar situation where it's overcast at 2,000. And then I decided, yeah, I can do this because I have VFR. My destination is VFR. They're going to stay that way. The weather looks good. It's just this place in the middle. But if I lost my engine and I came out below the clouds, I've got 2,000 feet to find someplace to go, and I'm in flat coastal land. So I'm not looking at mountains. That's a kind of a judgment call that comes with experience, I think, and a certain amount of training where I am an instrument pilot, I am an instrument instructor, I do have some training. I can get through a cloud deck without turning upside down. How would you advise a student on making a decision like that? Or not even a student, a private pilot, maybe he's got a couple $100. How would you advise somebody about the decision-making process? I'm not saying go or no go, but what do we think about in that situation?
So this is a private pilot who is not instrument rated, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, because my answer would be very different if they are instrument rated. So a private pilot who is not instrument rated, yes, I would say get comfortable being VFR on top, but always know what's underneath those clouds in the event that you have an emergency. Mm-hmm. Anytime you file a flight anywhere from point A to B, always know what you're flying over. I mean, it seems so obvious, but a lot of folks will fly over terrain that, should they have an engine failure, there's really no way out. And that is as long as you understand the risk associated with that, then if you're okay with that risk, then by all means go ahead, but know whether you can handle the terrain that's along that route where you're going to be VFR on top. And if it is something that you're comfortable with, then go ahead and do that. And then be mindful of the instrument training that you received during your private pilot license. Because if you do have to go through those clouds, that training is going to be very important to make sure that you don't get into spatial disorientation while you're going through those clouds.
Absolutely right. By the way, I have to say hey to Eric Pittman. He says, hey, Jamie got off work late, but he made it. Eric came and saw me at Sun and Fun. Eric, I fully expect you to write a question to ambassadors@aopa.org for our AirVenture show. I know you got questions. By the way, Eric is shopping for an airplane right now, and he's just about to take his private check ride, and I'm very proud of him. He's doing fine. But Kate, to your point, you're absolutely right. You know, the advice you'd give an instrument-rated pilot and the advice you'd give a non-instrument-rated pilot is very different. And one of the things I do regret, I did most of my flight training in Florida, greatest place in the world. I'll never change my mind. But we get very little actual IMC. I mean, we have, oh, man, it's beautiful, and no way, I'm not going flying. Pat, what do you talk to people about who have very little experience under adverse conditions, where maybe it's a scattered layer, but it's going broken, and I think I can get there before that? And man, if your choice is being stuck on top or scud running under, that's two really bad options. How do you talk to somebody about that to try and keep them on the right side of life?
Yeah, and the way you phrase that, I think I can make it. You know, if you have to, you know, begin your sentence with "I think I can make it," then that ought to be your decision right there. You know, to piggyback a little bit on what Kay had touched on here a few minutes ago, if you're not an instrument-rated pilot, and you're tempted to go up and fly VFR over the top, then you better get some actual. Go up with an instructor who's not afraid to go and fly in some actual, because if you think that you're ready to fly in the real clouds after you got 3 or 4 hours under the hood or in foggles, you are sadly mistaken.
Yeah, it's an intimidating moment, isn't it? When you get in there and realize I literally can't see anything. It's all instruments now. You
want to talk about the stress hormones, cortisol. You want to talk about the stress hormones that there are that you know that will hit you. No. I remember the very first time I was in the clouds, and I won't bore you with the entire story, but the very first time I was in the clouds was the very first flight I made after I got my instrument rating, because it happened to be 91 days of perfect weather in South Texas when I got my instrument rating. And on about the 95th day, I had a trip to make, and by God, I was going to make it, come hell or high water. And I launched into some marginal conditions, and pretty soon I was in the clouds, and I was so far behind the airplane and so out of my element, and scared me to death. It scared me to death. It was 5 years before I flew in the clouds again.
You know, that's true. Even that could be true even if you are instrument rated and you don't fly in the clouds that often. And I'll say I've been in that boat before, where I have a instrument rating. I am legally current. I don't need an instrument proficiency check, an IPC, and all that. But if you don't do that often enough, you're gonna be a little nervous. And so it's a point that should be made to instrument rated pilots also. You have to make sure that you're current and that you're using that. Now, in my neck of the woods, we get a lot of the marine layer that comes in, and you might get 2 minutes or 1 minute actual time. And so that's not a whole lot of time, but that's enough to keep you on the ground. And you shouldn't be going through that as a VFR pilot, but that doesn't make you proficient to fly a long flight in IMC, especially if you don't have autopilot and you're hand flying, because you'll get tired. And so I'm talking to the instrument pilots also. Make sure that that actual time is something that you're getting and fairly frequently.
Yeah, for me, the lack of an autopilot is a hard no. It's just a no-go.
I was just going to throw that in. Gary Risley makes a really interesting comment, and I'm not disagreeing with your instructor, Gary, saying his private pilot instructor told him if he got caught in the clouds, trim the airplane for minimum controllable airspeed into a slow 180 using mostly rudders to make the turn. That sounds good, and it is theoretically possible. And feel free, Pat and Kay, to disagree with me if you like. But a VFR pilot with no IFR experience trying to retrim the plane and make a 180 with no visual reference, probably coming out the bottom of that cloud inverted.
Yeah, that's an overload. In my opinion, that's an overload situation. It's too much.
Learning how to just make a standard rate turn, you know, where you're using the turn coordinator, put your little wing on the tab, just hold that turn to do 180.
Right.
That's a workload for a VFR pilot when you're suddenly deprived of vision. So, you know, it's one of those things, kind of like we just talked last episode about the impossible turn. And AOPA just did a great video on that. 4 different pilots, 4 different airplanes. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Same thing with a 180 VFR into IMC. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But if you're not really well versed in this, you're probably going to get overloaded very rapidly. Even with an autopilot, you've got to have the sense to say, okay, I'm not doing a steep turn. We're going to do this in a very organized fashion. By the way, Ronald Guy, Abilene, Texas. Pat, you ever been to Texas? Ronald Guy is a Texas student pilot out of Abilene, so you guys ought to know each other. There's certainly a barbecue place somewhere between you.
Probably 1 degree separation between us and George Strait.
Well, hey, I really appreciate this conversation. We're coming up with, we got 9 minutes left, which means we got 4 minutes left with Pat before he wets next door and starts educating a whole bunch of fast team people. But I think what this all comes down to, whether we're talking about fuel starvation or exhaustion, whether we're talking about CFIT, VFR into IMC, it's good planning, good decision making. And I'm going to say something wacky. Go talk to somebody else. You know, before I flew from Houston to Florida in the 152, Pat and I sat down and went over the whole flight. And I don't need Pat, but I need Pat. It's really good to talk to somebody and say, does this route make sense to you? You know this part of the route better than I do. Are you seeing a better way to go? What do you think, Kay? I mean, is it decision making, or is it luck, or is it just, hey, my plane's cooler than your plane? What is your thought?
I think it's the mindset. It's your attitude. And take the time and do the planning. And like yourself, Jamie, I also just flew across country just a few months ago from Indiana out here to California. And I spent a ton of time. And, you know, I'm a CFI experienced pilot like both of you, but we do our homework, and that made the flight very, very pleasant, because it was cross country that I hadn't done before, and there was areas where I wasn't familiar with. And so, in fact, I thought I might have talked to you too, Pat. I can't remember if I did or not. We did. Yeah, we talked also. And so I spoke to 2 instructors about this. And so that's my my biggest point. Make sure you're, again, I said it before, you're planning.
Glenn Ponis has just popped in. First of all, Glenn Ponis is a very smart man, so anybody listening to Glenn Ponis should. But he says during his primary training, his instructor made sure that his 3 hours of hood time was in IMC, and it gave him an immediate, to your point, Pat, an immediate and very intense understanding of how dangerous it is to go VFR into IMC. That is a shocking moment when it happens like that, because you're in it. It's not gradual.
Yeah, Glenn, your CFI ought to get a special prize for that. There too many don't do that. Yeah, he ought to get a special prize.
Well, and that's
if you have a CFII that won't. Oh, sorry. If you have a CFII that won't take you in the clouds, my suggestion is get another CFII.
Well, and that's one of the things, seriously, I think anyone who trains in Florida has to think about seriously. You might be instrument rated, you might be a II, but you have very little actual experience. And that's one of the challenges we have in GA with all these topics we're talking about today. We aren't in a crew-based system. We don't have another fully trained pilot. We don't have redundancy of systems necessarily. We're often on our own, and sometimes with family and friends with us. And Pat, as you talk about that, going into the IMC when you're a brand new instrument pilot and you thought you were okay, and then you find out, oh, maybe I'm not.
Yeah.
You add the additional distraction and stress of having family or friends in the aircraft, things can really spiral out of control quickly. So, and I say this for myself, being trained in Florida, you've got to go out and get some actual experience with a CFI, with somebody who knows how to do this, so that you've got some frame of reference to what it's really like. Because I'll tell you, one of the big surprises to me, I had no idea before I got my first actual experience, you don't move your head. You move your eyes. If you move your head, you're going to get sick and you're going to get disoriented. And I had no idea, because VFR, you move your head all over the place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You get the leans, and boy, I'll tell you what, that will mess you up.
I had that once. I got to admit, somebody from our flight school flew down to Naples or Punta Gorda a long, long time ago and got stuck for weather. And I flew down with somebody in IFR in a 172 RG, just pouring rain and gusting, and I had the leans so bad. I mean, I'm 30 degrees over to the right, convinced I'm level. And the instruments are telling you you're not. But, boy, this feels better. Not good. Not good at all. Well, Pat, you're about to leave us. Any closing comments? Because we just love having you here.
No, man, this is just so much fun to do. I love these kind of things. We get great comments, and I really look forward to every other Tuesday night that we get a chance to visit with each other and tell lies and tall tales and have a good time. But as far as the topics we've been talking about today, check and double check your fuel, visually check your fuel. Don't trust your calculations. Visually confirm it. You don't want to lose friends to a simple mathematical mistake. Use your charts. Pay attention to what the maximum en route or maximum elevation figures are. Those types of things. The magenta line is great, but as Kay pointed out, situational awareness isn't just I follow the magenta line or being a child of the magenta line. So I think those are probably the things I'm going to leave you with. And now I've got to go tell some lies to a bunch of other people.
Have a great time, Pat. Thanks for being here with us. And Kay, I'm just going to keep you on for a couple more minutes. Ronald Guy, by the way, asks, what time does this start? It's the second and fourth Tuesday of each month, Ronald. We start at 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific. You can do the math in between. But Kay, somebody just put up a post, a comment. I'm sorry, I missed their name as it was going by. But it's a really interesting point, because they were saying the FAA should require pilots to get some IMC training. You really can't do that because of the weather differences. It's much like in Alaska, there's an exception. You don't have to get the night training right away, because you can't. Speak to that for a moment, if you would, that we kind of have to take personal responsibility. The FAA has standards, but it's really up to us to know how current, how proficient we are, and what our aspirations are and how to train for that.
Absolutely. This comes down to your personal minimums. There are the FAA standards, but then there are your personal minimums. And for most of us, the personal minimums are higher than what the regulations call for. And so this is where you should plan to, fly with the CFII and go in and fly in the soup. And for instrument rated pilots too, maybe you're filing IFR flight plans all the time, but you're not actually getting a whole lot of actual time. Then take the opportunity and just think of it as a proficiency flight for yourself. And you don't have to wait for a flight review every 2 years to do this. Whenever you feel like you haven't actually, flown in instrument conditions, and if you're a private pilot, do it every, go maybe 6 months or once a year. Get in the clouds and see how it feels in a controlled environment. That'll be wonderful for your own safety. The other thing is practice, and we didn't talk about this earlier, but it's practicing unusual attitudes. In the event that you do get in and you find yourself in a very awkward bank or pitch, at least you'll know the correct sequence to get out of that situation.
Yeah, and you make an interesting point about you don't have to do a flight review every 2 years. You can do it more often if you want. I am very proud of the way we conduct things at AOPA. We do flight reviews every year. That if we're going to fly AOPA aircraft or rental aircraft as an AOPA employee, we need a flight review every year. And if we're going to do instrument flying, we need an instrument for proficiency check. an instrument proficiency check annually, and we have to do safety training quarterly. And we do an annual safety stand-down where everyone who flies for the company gets involved with an aviation safety stand-down thing. There's nothing wrong with going beyond the minimums. Keep it in mind, Kay, they're the minimums. That's the least you could do, literally. So try to do a little more.
And I would just budget for this, because I know flying is expensive and it kind of keeps us on the ground more than we want. But if you have the mindset, okay, I'm going to do this, this is important to me, and I'm going to schedule it on my calendar and I'm going to budget for it, then you're more likely to accomplish it.
Absolutely right. Kay, thank you so much for being here. Pat, in absentia, we enjoyed him tremendously. Folks, we're going to be back here the second and fourth Tuesdays of each month. The next time is July 13th. Mark your calendar. But very critically, July 26th, the week of July 26th is AirVenture, and we will do a special ambassadors episode for AirVenture because AirVenture is such a huge deal. So write your questions in to ambassadors@aopa.org on any topic you want. Now, let's leave Kay's personal life out of it. But if it has something to do with aerospace or aviation or whatever, give us a shout on that. Kay, you got any closing comments you'd like to share with the world?
I hope to see you at Oshkosh.
Okay, I like it. Folks, thanks for being here. We really do appreciate it. And special thanks to Eric Webb with the C and the K, and the coffee cans and the fishing line and the truck full of batteries. Appreciate you keeping us up and running, Eric. Y'all take care. We'll see you next time.